Hi everyone, Peter here from Movement and Performance, and in this video I'm going to be creating a strength and conditioning annual plan for a soccer team or athlete. So the first thing we need to take into consideration is in this template I've got laid out, all I've got is the months laid out with the weeks of the year, so 1 to 52. Training period, we will get into all of this sort of stuff, but also I've got filled out is when they have games. So that's obviously going to be prescribed in the fixtures. So this area here from all these cells here are basically the in-season games, and these ones here are pre-season games. So first thing we can do is we can determine that this here is the in-season. And then we can start determining the other training periods. So let's assume that obviously this is going to be decided by the club or coach, but let's say after the season they have 4 weeks of a 4-week off season where they don't have any training with the club. Then they have a pre-season period, and then the last 2 weeks of the year when everyone's on holidays, that could be the off season as well. So that's the off season, and here is the part of the pre-season. And then on this side, this again, maybe the first 2 weeks are off season, and then this entire 10 or so weeks here is the pre-season as well. So now we've determined, we've sort of split the year into different training periods, and we can now start planning what we're going to do during these periods. So also one thing to note is that these games here, the lighter colors here, so these light colors, light yellow, practice games in the preseason. These very bright yellow, they are regular season games. And these sort of darker squares here, so these ones and then these ones that are even darker, basically indicate importance. So the darker it is, the more important the game is, and the more fresh they have to be. So it might be they're playing a hard opponent. It could be here, this could be their finals or something, or it could be they have cup games during the week as well on those days, so they need to be fresher. So whatever the reason is, it's basically a hierarchy of importance where the bright yellow indicates less important, and the darker the yellow, the more important it is, and they're sort of interspersed randomly throughout the season. These might be buys or having no games during this week. So let's get straight into it. First thing is our speed training. Actually, before we get into that, because their whole entire season is the entire year, they get smashed in a long season, depending on what level you're playing at and what age. We're going to consider the off-season periods here as active rest periods. So they're not actually going to be any training. Whether you actually do training, then that's different. But for this plan, we're going to say that they are active rest periods. So no prescribed training. So all the off-season periods. AR. And also here. Okay, so now we can get into actually planning the training for the year. So the first thing, I've got a few categories on the left-hand side. So where it says speed, change of direction, power, these are sort of the main components that we're going to be working on as strength and conditioning coaches. So in terms of speed training, we can sort of basically, before we actually prescribe what exactly we're going to do, we can break this season and the year up into training blocks. So you can see here, this sort of training block, we can make them one cell, one block of training. We might have a block of training here, so we can sort of break the year up into training blocks, determine how important each block is. So in terms of speed training, first thing we're probably going to want to work on is going to be, we'll start here in the early preseason. So that's where we're going to build a really general base. We might want to work on the acceleration qualities. So that's going to be our main focus. And then going on throughout the preseason, leading into the in-season, we might continue our acceleration work, and then we might move into some maximum velocity running. And these aren't hard blocks completely. This is only acceleration. This is only max velocity. It's sort of the emphasis. So it could be just a gradual increase from short linear running with lower speeds up to higher, faster linear running with longer distances. So then we get into the in-season period, and essentially in the in-season, the athletes, the players are going to be doing a lot of soccer practice. So we need to try and work on the qualities that don't actually get trained during soccer practice and games. So we can probably work on more acceleration type qualities, acceleration and maximum velocity type qualities, because they really never get this sort of stuff during the season. They never really reach top speed, and they never really have any like resisted type running. So because we broken the year into blocks, we might put the maximum type velocity emphasis where we need to be more peaked. So around these blocks here. So maybe these might be the maximum velocity emphasis training blocks. So we might put some acceleration here when we don't particularly need to be at our best. Then we might throw in some maximum velocity training. And then we might have a nice big chunk of acceleration here because we don't really need to be anywhere near our best at this point in time, where there's no really important games. Then we might do some maximum velocity again, and we might just intersperse this throughout the year, and then maybe some acceleration. So that's speed done. Now let's move on to our change of direction type work. Okay. So in terms of change of direction, we want to basically pair up similar qualities. So starting here again, we might do our very sort of mild change of direction drills in the preseason to build that nice base. Still focusing on mild change of direction, just getting somewhat more intensive, and then before the season starts, so we can be at our best, then we can have our more intensive change of direction training. Moving on through the season, because they get so much change of direction, soccer players, during their sporting practice, we can break it into blocks, but the thing I'm going to do here is actually reduce the size of the font to indicate that the volume of this sort of training is very low. So we might still do our same sort of block periodization, but I'm going to reduce the size of the font so that you can get the idea that the emphasis is very low, even though we're still having those qualities there. And we're going to pair up sort of our intensive change of direction with our higher velocity running, and our more mild change of direction with our acceleration. And these last few blocks here, we might actually, I made the font slightly bigger, and that is on purpose to sort of indicate that maybe we might put a little bit more emphasis and a little bit more time spent on these sort of things when we need to be more at our best, because we have some important games coming up. So moving on to our power type training, once again, we're going to split this into blocks. And again, we're going to pair our power training with the sort of other qualities that we're training at this time. So we're going to start off, we'll start here again, and I'm going to break our power training into slow power, fast power, and then plyometrics. So our slow power is more our higher force and lower velocity type movements, but they're still explosive. Whereas our fast power is more lighter loads but higher velocity. And then our plyometrics is obviously our jumping and running and that sort of thing involving the stretch shortening cycle. So I'm putting it in this order, sort of in the preseason. That's when we can really put some emphasis into our power type training as well as all the other training, and we can really get ourselves peaked for the season because we don't have as much training and games on. So we can sort of start with building that base and then slowly work our way towards our higher intensity plyometrics. Then the same thing, we're going to emphasize this throughout the season, and we are going to, again, pair it up the quality. So we're going to pair our slow power with our acceleration type work, and then we're going to pair our fast power or plyometrics with our maximum velocity type work because they work well together. And we're going to put our plyometrics and our fast power where we need to be a little bit more peaked because that's more specific to the demands of the game. So towards the end of the season here, where we need to be a bit more peaked because the games are a bit more important, we're going to start including some plyometric type work. Because if we do that throughout the entire season, we sort of lose our base. So we need to intersperse a lot of slower power type stuff to actually make sure we're maintaining that base. So moving on now to our strength work. Really we have basically, there's not too much variation we do with strength. We can do our general type strength work and then our more maximal type strength work. That's about it. The only difference being one is basically higher reps and a little bit more volume, and the max strength is a little bit higher load and less volume. So we'll start with general strength again to build that base, because we have, in this period here, we have absolutely no games. So this is where we don't need to be peaked at all, and we have the opportunity to build our nice big base. So work on all the qualities we don't really get to work on during the season. And then again, we're going to block all these the year off. But because there's no real, there's only sort of two real things we can do. We can either do heavier loads or lighter loads. We are going to basically do the we're going to do the general type strength when we are sort of don't need to be as peaked, and again we're going to pair everything up. So we'll pair our general strength with our, again, acceleration and slower type power exercises, and then we're going to do our maximal strength when we need to be a bit more peaked. So again, here in the season, I'm going to show that with this I'm going to show with these blocks what we're going to work on and where we're going to actually have ourselves peaked. So we're going to pair them up like we were. Maximal strength, general strength, and then maximal strength. And again, these are paired up. So maximal strength where we need to be a bit more peaked, general strength when we can push the volume a little bit, we don't need to be at our best. And the last thing we're going to actually plan is our hypertrophy training. Not that soccer players need excessive hypertrophy, but it does help to have some sort of hypertrophy base. So in the sort of off-season period, that's going to be our opportunity, again with the higher volumes that we're able to do. We can emphasize hypertrophy a bit more. If I can spell. But the thing is, in the season, we just don't have the time or the volume to dedicate to hypertrophy work. So the entire in-season, we're basically hypertrophy sort of on the back burner. So I'm going to indicate that here with smaller font. So that means we are sort of doing some hypertrophy work, but it's not emphasized, and we're sort of doing enough to, if we can, maintain what we've got. And the last thing, conditioning. So conditioning is an interesting one depending on your role at the club or with the athlete. So basically, there is, because the athletes play their soccer games and they do their training, they get any conditioning effect from that. So do we really need to actually do any conditioning? And I guess it depends on what they're doing in their training. But I think that the best way to do it is in the pre-season periods. Definitely include some general conditioning leading into more specific conditioning, because you have you can push the volume a little bit with your athletes, and then sort of transition into more specific type conditioning like interval type training or like repeat sprint type training. So we're going to start with general aerobic conditioning base, followed by some longer interval stuff, and then some shorter interval to more replicate what happens in a soccer game. And then in the season is where it gets a bit tricky. Do you need to do any conditioning? I think the best way to do it is to not actually do any conditioning. Leave it for the training to take care of it, unless you've been specifically told that you want conditioning to be done, and it's a weakness potentially of the athlete or the team. I would say in season, maybe do only conditioning, some very general conditioning if needed. So you can do more cycling type stuff to unload the athletes or swimming and to keep that base that they have. In addition to that, you can do top-ups where necessary. So players, for example, don't play, you might be able to do some extra conditioning with those players that didn't play in the match, for example. Or injured players may not be able to do their particular training, so they might need some extra cross-training conditioning or something like that. But again, I'm going to leave this in smaller font to show that there's not much emphasis on it. So the next thing we're going to go to is our testing. When are we going to test our athletes to make sure, to monitor them, to make sure they're actually progressing, and see how they're doing, and we can adjust our training. So I'm going to put a few, maybe we'll start on this side here where we have, so we're just finishing the off season. So maybe the first sort of coming back from our off season, see how the athletes, see how their fitness is, and then maybe at the end of their first pre-season period, test them again to see how they're going. And then after their little break, maybe test them again to see how much they've retained. And then after the pre-season, just before the season, let's see how they are, so that we know that they're entering the season with a solid fitness. They should be at a pretty high fitness level by then. Then we might do mid sort of season, maybe where they have no game. We can do some testing to see how they're going throughout the season, make sure they're not declining. And if they are, we may need to adjust our training. And then maybe the end of the season to see how they've held up through the second half of the season. And then potentially employ some strategies in the next season to, if they've sort of declined, to actually help them maintain their fitness throughout the season. The second last part is just our holiday periods. So we're just going to say during their off-season periods that they're on holidays. I think it's a well-deserved break for a lot of players because they get pretty smashed throughout the season. So we'll say they can have their holidays whenever they have their off-season. And then the last thing is the peaking index, and essentially that's basically a theoretical number or index to sort of get an idea of where the athletes are going to be at their best and when they're not going to be at their best. So we can get an idea of how we're going to perform. So starting here, I will start it here again. Basically in their sort of off-season period here, doing nothing, they're probably going to be pretty poor. So we're going to use a number, and the higher the number, the lower the basically the less peak they are. So from 1 to 10. So in these sort of periods here, they're not going to be very good. So in their off season, during their preseason, they have some training, but they're not going to be at their best because they're not doing any specific enough training, and the volume is very high. So this might be maybe an 8. And then here they're starting to get few games, a bit more training, a bit more intensity. So they're going to be a little bit more peaked at this point. So then moving in to the season, again, depending on where we placed our sort of blocks of when we want to be peaked and when we don't really need to be peaked, we then can determine sort of roughly their peaking index. So around through the season, here's a bit more of a, so maybe it will be a bit more peaked during those blocks that we put the more specific training in. And then throughout the season, they should be at pretty good levels when they are sort of at those important games if we did our training correctly. Okay. And then the last thing to go through is basically the volume and intensity. So I've done this previously because I don't want to bore you with all the numbers. But essentially, I've got a graph here, and on this sheet here, I've basically got all the data, volume and intensity, basically on a 1 to 10 scale. So we know when we're going to push the volume and drop off the intensity, and when we're going to drop the intensity and push the volume a little bit. So if I just add these in, we can get an idea, and it should correspond to the weeks we've got here and the training we've done. So series values. That's our volume, and now let's add our intensity. Sorry, we're having some technical errors. And now let's add the intensity. And now we should have, basically, this graph should correspond with the weeks that we and the plan that we just created. So as we can see here, the volume sort of accumulate, or starting here, the volume starts to accumulate. So we've got pretty high volumes here in the preseason, and again continues to accumulate pretty high. And then as soon as we get in the season, the volume drops off quite significantly throughout the entire season, a little bit of fluctuation, and the lower volumes sort of where we need to be more peaked, and the intensity is basically the opposite. So we're going to have more intensity, we're going to have less intensity where the volume's higher, so we can get that volume to build those sort of foundational adaptations, and then the intensity sort of starts to increase the more we need to be at our peak. So as you can see here, these sort of parts where we've sort of more at our peak, we have greater intensity and lower volumes, sort of have it even out here, and then sort of towards the end, our intensity gets pretty high and our volume drops off quite a bit, so we can be at our best. So thanks for watching, everyone. Hopefully you got something out of this video and you learned something. This is my method to creating an annual plan for pretty much all sports, and it's always developing over time. You can check out the other videos on this channel, creating an annual plan for team sport athletes, and then also creating an annual plan for an Olympic weightlifting athlete, which is a little bit different. That's an individual sport, so the plan looks somewhat different. Anyway, hopefully you got something out of this, and thanks for watching.